Greetings. My name is Mike Manfredo, and I'm the department head of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at Colorado State University. I'm joined today by Dr. Teel, who's my co-investigator on this project. We're delighted to at least see you and talk with you by video. We apologize for not being there in person. We were so looking forward to it, but events conspired against us, and so here we are doing the best we can. So thanks for taking the time to listen to us, and let's get started. I do want to acknowledge our Slovenian co-authors who are listed on this slide and likely at the conference and can answer questions about the project if you are so interested to learn more. What we're going to do is explore the origins of values toward wildlife in the Euro-American zone. Let me begin by acknowledging the group of researchers involved, and then I'll give a brief description of what I mean by values and the specific values that we looked at, and then I'll tell you our story. Here's the immediate authors, as you can see on this slide. The project I'm going to report on, however, was a collaboration of more than 40 researchers who are listed on this particular slide. You know, we used a crowdsourcing approach so that the costs of data collection were shared amongst many co-investigators along with their input and involvement. So using surveys, we measured social values across 33 countries, and our definition of values was adopted from psychology. Here, values are defined as transsituational goals and principles. They're core to culture, they're deeply seated and durable, they're a keystone to human thought, they're also reflected in policy. Policies talk about and reflect the values that are important to a society. So in this particular study, we measured two opposing values that are widely prevalent in the Euro-American zone: domination and mutualism. Domination sees wildlife as a resource available to humans as they wish. By contrast, those with mutualism see values as part of their social community, deserving of rights like humans. We measured these two concepts with an item scale that's been developed over a 25-year period and been applied a great many times. Now, let's talk a little about this story. One of the most significant events that completely reshaped the world in the past 500 years was a sudden burst of imperialism out of Europe in the 1500s. The competition among European powers that fueled this imperialistic race ended in European control of 85% of the world's countries. Through colonization and acculturation, this reshaped the ideology of virtually all people and cultures in the world. So as we look at this phenomena a bit more closely, the result of colonization in any specific country was largely dependent on the nature of the invading country. So as we look at the Americas, the North was shaped by British influence, and the South by Iberian influence, Portugal and Spain. So as you look at the literature, one explanation for economic differences between North and South America focuses on the differences in colonizing governance institutions. As the argument goes, the British had loose control that allowed innovation, while Iberia had strong hierarchy, which did not necessarily reward social invention. This is likely part of the explanation of what we see as differences, but certainly not all of it. Another powerful explanation suggests the importance of religious culture of the colonizing countries. So the Lutheran Reformation is credited for giving rise to the domination ideology and a divine right and a responsibility to dominate over all living things. This ideology has also been credited with the birth of, for example, capitalism and the Cartesian sciences. So this, of course, was the religious culture of the northern European countries, while the southern were, of course, Catholic. So to what extent do we find support for these explanations in our findings? Well, let's look at the value distribution amongst the countries that we examined. First, we do find North America, with, remember, the institutional linkages to Great Britain, more domination-oriented than Latin America with Iberian colonization. You can see between these, so the top slide that you're looking at there shows mutualism in the top panel and domination in the bottom. And as you look, the darker the green, the more mutualist, and then the darker the brown in the bottom one, the more domination oriented. And this contrast is, quite frankly, stunning. We just never expected to find such contrasting values and how people think about animals in these different places, but we did find this. Now, if we, and this is interesting because if we look to see whether or not current day Latin America is similar to Spain and Portugal, it clearly is, but Britain has drifted a bit from North America. So if you look at the institutions there in the center, and we just one circle around both Great Britain and as well as the Iberian countries. And so what you can see is the Iberian-oriented countries are quite similar now to the way South America is now, but Britain has drifted a bit away from both Canada and the US. So we have partial support, and we have a realization that a lot has changed in Britain over the time period, particularly since the turn of the 20th century. Next, let's take a look at this. We explored using HLM, hierarchical linear modeling, to see whether or not there was a second level effect due to religious culture. And so I'm not saying whether or not an individual acted in a certain way or was influenced in a certain way, but we're talking about second level, which means the entire country, its norms, its customs, etc. So we're reflecting on the country and in its enduring value orientations. And here you can see it is quite remarkably different. In other words, the British institutional origins are much lower on mutualism, along with other northern European countries. So the Iberian influenced countries in southern Europe are very mutualism oriented compared to that. And the opposite is true when it comes to domination. So the historically Catholic countries are much less domination oriented, and the North American countries, historically Protestant, are much more domination oriented. Finally, we would note that we found indigenous people of Latin America to be strongly mutualist, and not that we were terribly surprised, but it is interesting because the Iberian culture was more harmonious with this view and led to an acculturation process of Latin America that was generally not present in North America, where indigenous people were socially dominated and displaced and isolated. So we feel like there's some similarity in how indigenous people were treated that parallels how wildlife was treated in these two different countries. So why is this important? Well, when you look at the foundation of conservation, it was really emanated from characters of the early 20th century in the US, people like Teddy Roosevelt here, Gifford Pinchot, and Aldo Leopold, and they didn't do this outside of influence. Europe was very influential in this, but these ideas caught on in a way that ideas were embellished and shipped to the rest of the world. And conservation is the origins of conservation ideology that is taught around the world is born from a domination set of values in North America. And quite frankly, it's probably something that needs to change as we go forward. So this is some of the background research on the values and why we have the values we have in the Euro-American zone. Dr. Teel will now talk a little bit about the management meaning of all this.
Hello, everyone. So building on the background that Mike has presented, I'll now provide some illustrations that speak to the utility of wildlife values information and conservation, particularly in terms of addressing the challenge of human-wildlife conflict. Human-wildlife conflict is a global phenomenon with significant impacts on wildlife and on people's livelihoods and well-being. The IUCN's Human-Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Specialist Group defines human-wildlife conflict as, quote, struggles that emerge when the presence or behavior of wildlife poses an actual or perceived, direct and recurring threat to human interests or needs, leading to disagreements between groups of people and negative impacts on people and/or wildlife. These conflicts are obviously largely rooted in social factors, including human values, which not only form the basis for the problems themselves, but they also define the context in which conservation interventions or mitigation strategies are to be applied. In response to this situation with our global study, we released this policy brief, along with a press release ahead of the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting in Canada last December. We focused specifically on the CBD's Target 4, which centers on human-wildlife conflict, and we built upon the IUCN Human-Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Specialist Group's proposed revisions to the target and its indicators. We recommended that the convention consider adopting our global assessment as a basis for monitoring trends in human willingness to coexist with wildlife to inform progress on Target 4 achievement in the next decade. We also shared our findings from this at the Global Human-Wildlife Conflict Conference hosted by the Specialist Group in March of this year at Oxford. As a general example of our findings used in the policy brief, we found a strong relationship between wildlife values and how people perceive important global wildlife issues, including illegal hunting, illegal wildlife trade, and the loss of habitats and species. As you can see here, while concern across all regions is quite high for these global wildlife issues, countries with a higher prevalence of mutualism values, as in Latin America, show higher levels of concern for these issues. Conversely, countries with greater emphasis on domination values, like those in North America and Nordic Europe, have a smaller representation of people who believe these are serious issues. This illustrates how values are important because they affect people's attitudes and their behaviors toward wildlife-related issues. Here's a more specific example in relation to human-wildlife conflict, which is often addressed through reactive strategies, such as killing the animals involved. On the survey, we examined acceptance of lethal control for different wildlife species involved in various human-wildlife conflict scenarios. Overall, we found that wildlife values are a strong predictor of that acceptance, regardless of the situation or species. Countries with a greater prevalence of domination values, again, the North American and Nordic countries, are more accepting of lethal removal. In contrast, Latin America, with a higher prevalence of mutualism values, has greater opposition to lethal control measures. Interestingly, among the European countries, Slovenia had one of the lowest percentages of domination-oriented residents, 22%, which translated into lower support for lethal removal, below 40%. Which is somewhat mirroring the Iberian countries in terms of their response. While we see general trends and overall support for lethal control, it's also important to recognize that people's attitudes vary based on the context or the situation. And here we do in fact see variation in results by the human-wildlife conflict scenarios. So going from left to right, top to bottom, you see that we asked about attacks on humans, attacks on livestock, the wildlife carrying a disease transmissible to humans, wildlife carrying a disease transmissible to livestock, crop damage, and then involvement in vehicle collisions. And we find that there's a much higher level of acceptance of lethal control in situations involving direct threats to human safety, such as attacks on humans or disease risk, and livestock depredation compared to the other incidents like crop damage. And here we see that attitudes also vary based on the species involved in the conflict. So we asked about a number of different species, including ones that may not be present in the resident's country, just to get a sense for response to species across the world. And we asked about, as you see here, wild boar, wolves, capybaras, deer, leopards, elephants, monkeys, and geese. Acceptance tends to be greater, for example, for the predator or carnivore species like wolves and leopards. Acceptance is also higher for wild boar, which are considered invasive in many areas. Alternatively, acceptance is much lower for elephants, a more charismatic species, and geese, which are involved in more nuisance-type situations, less severe. These graphs provide the actual evidence of the impact of values on support for lethal control. Across all species, we found a high correlation between the percent of people emphasizing mutualism values, in other words, the mutualists, in a country, and that's displayed on the x-axis, and then acceptance of lethal control on the y-axis. And this serves as an example of how values can translate into support or opposition for policy. It also shows how there's less support for traditional forms of management like lethal control with a higher prevalence of mutualism. And ultimately, the success of conservation and management strategies hinges on the extent to which those strategies match the sociocultural context in which they're implemented. Values information can offer a tool to assess that context and the social sustainability of proposed strategies. Another implication or takeaway from this that Mike alluded to could be that the common approach in North America, in this case of lethal removal, which is rooted in a domination ideology, may not be feasible in other parts of the world where values differ. I wanted to end with an illustration of how values information can be meaningful when applied to more local scales too, such as regions within states or countries. And this is something that we plan to explore further in our global effort through case studies within countries, for example. This map is based on results from our long-term research on wildlife values in the US. And specifically, it shows what we're calling the sociocultural index, which is displayed for all counties within states from surveys conducted in 2018 and predictive modeling that we did since then. The index represents the ratio or proportion of mutualists out of the total proportion of those emphasizing either a domination or mutualism orientation. So basically, higher scores indicate a greater prevalence of mutualism, which is shown in the blue versus the brown color shades. And as you can see, the vast expanse of the US is occupied by more domination-oriented areas, primarily in the less populated rural regions. And that corresponds to low sociocultural index scores. Our research has also shown that modernization factors, including increased education, income, and urbanization, are associated with a gradual shift toward mutualism values in the US, which is reflected in the greater prevalence of mutualism in the more urban areas. We recently applied this county-level approach to the issue of wolf reintroduction in Colorado in the US. A citizen ballot initiative was voted on and passed in 2020, which essentially mandates that the state wildlife agency, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which is the government authority, reintroduce wolves over the next several years. On the left, you see the sociocultural index displayed across counties within the state of Colorado, which is basically the square with the lines around it. Again, higher scores indicate a greater prevalence of mutualism, the blue versus brown color shades. And then on the right, we're depicting support for lethal control of wolves that kill livestock. And the Southern Rockies ecoregion, which is the suitable wolf habitat, is depicted in the black outline in both panels. What we see here is that prospects for public support of wolf reintroduction are good, meaning there's relatively high tolerance, but there are exceptions or small pockets of potential resistance that exist, which is shown by the lower sociocultural index values, the dark brown shade, and greater support for lethal removal in certain counties on the right, also the dark brown. And this is an example of linking ecological or biological information to social science data, which gives us a more integrated and holistic approach for identifying conflict hotspots that can inform decision-making and the need for outreach and so on. It can facilitate more targeted efforts as well by having data at more local or regional levels beyond the overall state or country findings that may not always match what you see on the ground in different locations. So again, we're looking to expand our global wildlife values effort to look at these kinds of situations within countries or within regions. So to conclude, I've included our contact information here, our email addresses, and we're working on creating a website now too for the global values effort. Do please feel free to reach out if you have questions or you're interested in learning more. And I also want to say thanks again so much for listening, and also to the organizers for allowing us to deliver the presentation virtually. I'm sorry that we couldn't be there. We also again want to thank our Slovenian collaborators, Irina, Alexandra, and Meta, for their involvement in the global study.